The air inside the old Boston church smelled of weathered wood and melted wax, a heavy scent that clung to my skin as I stood there, clutching a bouquet of white carnations so tightly my knuckles ached. The stained glass windows cast fractured beams of light across the pews, but I couldn't see them. Only the echoes of their colors danced in my mind, pieced together from my father's stories. Today was my wedding day, though it felt more like a sentencing. The groom, Julian Carter, a cold, towering CEO whose name alone could silence a boardroom, was striding toward me, his polished shoes clicking against the stone floor with the precision of a metronome. Each step rang out like a tolling bell, sealing my fate. I didn't want this. Not him, not the ring, not the suffocating weight of a vow I hadn't chosen. But my father's voice, frail and trembling, had anchored me to this moment. "Claire," he'd whispered last night, his hands shaking as he gripped my arm. "You're our last hope. The company's gone under, and this is the only way." His cough had rattled through the silence of our crumbling family home, a sound that still echoed in my ears as I stood here, dressed in white silk that felt more like chains than a gown. The Carters' wealth could save us. Save him, from the debt that had eaten us alive since Mom died. So I'd nodded, swallowed my pride, and let him hand me over like a bargaining chip. The organ swelled, its notes weaving through the murmurs of the congregation. Boston's elite, no doubt, their whispers sharp with curiosity about the nobody marrying Julian Carter. I couldn't see their faces, but I felt their eyes, prickling my skin like needles. My fingers tightened around the bouquet, the soft petals brushing my palms, a fragile contrast to the storm brewing inside me. I hated this. Hated how Julian's presence loomed over me even before he spoke, his cologne a faint whiff of cedar and steel that marked him as untouchable. When he reached my side, his hand brushed mine to slip the ring onto my finger. His touch was ice cold, mechanical, like he was signing a contract rather than pledging a life. The metal band felt heavy, foreign, a shackle disguised as gold. "Repeat after me," the priest intoned, his voice a distant hum beneath the pounding in my chest. I barely heard the words, love, honor, obey, because they meant nothing here. This wasn't love. It was a transaction. Julian's voice came next, low and steady, cutting through the haze like a blade. "I, Julian Carter, take you, Claire Evans, to be my lawful wedded wife." No warmth, no hesitation, just the clipped precision of a man who'd built an empire on control. My turn came, and I forced the words out, my throat dry as sandpaper. "I, Claire Evans, take you, Julian Carter." I faltered, the lie catching, in my chest, but my father's cough from the back row pushed me forward. "To be my lawful wedded husband." The congregation clapped, a hollow sound that bounced off the stone walls, but I felt no joy, only a sinking dread. Julian turned, to face me fully, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I sensed them, sharp, assessing, stripping me bare without a word. The priest pronounced us man and wife, and the organ roared back to life, drowning out the silence between us. We stepped down the aisle together, his arm a rigid formality under mine, guiding me like I was a piece of furniture to be placed. My bouquet trembled in my grip, a few petals breaking free to scatter across the floor, white flecks against the gray stone, like pieces of me falling away. Outside, the sea air hit me, salty and sharp, as we moved toward the waiting car. The crowd's voices faded, replaced by the distant crash of waves against the cliffs, a sound I'd always loved, now tainted by this day. Julian opened the car door, his movements brisk, efficient. "Get in," he said, his tone flat, as if I were an employee rather than a bride. I slid onto the leather seat, the cold biting through my dress, and he followed, shutting the door with a thud that felt final. The car rolled forward, tires humming against the pavement, and I stared ahead, fingers still clutching the ruined bouquet. My new husband sat beside me, silent, a wall of ice I couldn't breach. I wanted to scream, to tear off this dress and run back to the life I'd known, poor but free. But Dad's face flashed in my mind, gaunt, lined with worry, his breath shallow from years of stress and sickness. He'd given everything for me after Mom's death, and now it was my turn. This marriage was his lifeline, his chance to die, with some dignity instead of disgrace. I couldn't abandon him, no matter how much I despised the man next to me. Julian shifted, his sleeve brushing mine, and I flinched. He noticed. Of course he did. Nothing escaped him. "You're my wife on paper," he murmured, his voice low, cutting through the hum of the engine. "Don't expect anything more." His words were a gauntlet thrown down, a challenge wrapped in indifference. I turned my head toward him, though I couldn't see his face, and let the anger I'd buried rise to the surface. "Good," I shot back, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I don't want anything from you." The petals in my lap slipped to the floor, crushed beneath my fingers, their faint sweetness lost in the leather and cedar scent of the car. I straightened my spine, staring into the darkness ahead. If this was a prison, I'd survive it. Not for Julian, not for his wealth, but for the man coughing in the shadows of that church. My father's honor was all I had left to protect, and I'd hold it tight, even if it meant standing beside a stranger who'd never know me. The car sped on, carrying us into a future I couldn't predict, but I made a silent vow of my own. I'd be no one's pawn, not even his. The ocean roared beyond the walls of Julian's cliffside mansion, a restless murmur that seeped through the windows and wrapped around me as I sat on the leather sofa, my fingers tracing its smooth, cool surface. It had been a week since the wedding, a week of living in this gilded prison, where every room gleamed with wealth I didn't want and silence I couldn't escape. The place smelled of salt air and polished wood, a sterile perfume that clung to everything, even me. Julian moved through it like a ghost, his presence marked only by the sharp click of his office door or the faint buzz of his voice barking orders over the phone. To him, I was invisible, another piece of furniture, expensive but unremarkable. I'd unpacked nothing. My suitcase sat untouched in the corner of the guest room he'd assigned me. No shared bed, no pretense of intimacy. The closet held a single dress he'd had delivered, a sleek black thing that hung there like a uniform I was expected to wear. Every night we sat across from each other at the long dining table, the clink of silverware against porcelain the only conversation between us. The food was exquisite. Lobster drizzled with butter, wine that probably cost more than my father's old car, but it tasted like ash in my mouth. I ate because I had to, not because I cared. Julian didn't seem to notice. His eyes stayed, fixed on his plate, his jaw tight, as if I were a problem he'd already solved. That morning, I'd found a box in the attic while searching for something, anything, to distract me from the suffocating quiet. It was tucked behind a stack of old files, a small wooden thing with my father's initials carved into the lid. My hands shook as I pried it open, the hinges creaking like a warning. Inside were papers, yellowed receipts, a ledger, and a letter in Dad's shaky handwriting. "Julian, please," it began. "We've been partners for years. Don't let them take everything." The date was 20 years old. The ink faded, but the desperation still raw. I sank to the floor, the cold marble biting through my jeans as the pieces fell into place. Dad had begged Julian for help when the company faltered, and Julian had turned him away. The betrayal had broken us, left us drowning in debt until this marriage became our lifeline. And now I was here, a pawn in a game Julian had rigged from the start. I wanted to run. The keys to the car he'd given me burned a hole in my pocket, tempting me to drive back to Dad's crumbling house and leave this all behind. But then I saw him in my mind. his thin frame hunched over the kitchen table, coughing into a handkerchief stained with years of struggle. He'd sold me to Julian not out of greed, but out of love. A desperate bid to keep us afloat after Mom's hospital bills had drained him dry. I couldn't abandon him now, not when his pride hung by a thread. So I stayed, trapped in this glass cage, staring out at the ocean I couldn't touch. That evening, Julian emerged from his office earlier than usual, his tie loosened, a faint shadow of stubble on his jaw. He carried a garment bag over one arm, the plastic rustling as he dropped it onto the sofa beside me. "There's an event tonight," he said, his voice flat, like he was reading a memo. "You'll need to look the part." I unzipped the bag, revealing a coat. Cashmere, deep navy, the kind of thing I'd never have afforded in my old life. It smelled faintly of lavender, pristine and untouched, a stark contrast to the worn sweaters I'd grown up with. I slipped it on, the fabric, soft against my skin, but it felt wrong, like a costume for a role I didn't want to play. "Don't think this changes anything," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. I stood, smoothing the coat's lapels, and met his gaze, or what I imagined was his gaze, cold and unyielding behind those eyes I'd never seen soften. "You can dress me up, parade me around, but don't think you own me." My words hung in the air, a defiance I hadn't planned but couldn't stop. Julian's lips twitched, the barest hint of a smile, though it held no warmth. "I don't need to own you, Claire," he replied, his tone smooth as ice. "You're here because you chose to be. That's enough." He turned away, adjusting his cufflinks with a flick of his wrist, dismissing me as easily as he'd summoned me. I followed him to the car, the coat heavy on my shoulders, my sneakers scuffing the polished driveway. The driver opened the door, and I slid in beside Julian, the leather seat creaking under my weight. The engine purred to life, carrying us into the night, the ocean fading to a distant hum. I stared out the window, though the darkness offered no answers, my fingers curling into fists. He thought I'd chosen this, chosen him, but he was wrong. I'd chosen Dad, chosen the honor of a family that had nothing left but its name. Julian might control the money, the power, the world outside these windows, but he'd never control me. The car slowed as we approached the city, the glow of lights bleeding through the glass, a reminder of the life I'd lost. I leaned back, the coat's collar brushing my neck, and let the anger simmer. If this was my cage, I'd learn its bars, study them, test them, until I found a way to bend them. Not for Julian, not for his empire, but for the man who'd raised me, who'd taught me that love meant sacrifice. I'd wear this coat tonight, play his game, but I'd never forget who I was beneath it. The ocean's roar lingered in my ears, a promise of freedom I wouldn't let slip away. The chandelier above glittered like a constellation trapped in glass, casting a warm glow over the banquet hall where I sat, my fingers nervously smoothing the silk of my dress. The fabric clung to me, a deep burgundy Julian had chosen, elegant, expensive, and utterly foreign. Around me, the room buzzed with the chatter of Boston's elite, their laughter sharp and hollow, slicing through the soft hum of a violin quartet in the corner. The air smelled of red wine and roasted pheasant, a heady mix that turned my stomach. As I perched beside Julian, his presence a wall of silence I couldn't breach. Tonight, I was his wife in public for the first time, a role I played with gritted teeth and a spine steeled against the weight of their stares. He leaned forward, his elbow brushing mine as he addressed the table, executives in tailored suits, their wives dripping in diamonds. "Claire's been a wonderful addition," he said, his voice smooth as polished steel, a lie wrapped in charm. "The perfect Mrs. Carter." The words landed like a stone in my chest, and I forced a smile, my lips tight, tasting the bitterness of his performance. They nodded, raising their glasses, oblivious to the ice in his eyes when he glanced my way. a fleeting look that said I was a prop, not a partner. I adjusted my napkin, the crisp linen ruff against my fingertips, and swallowed the urge to call him out right there. The conversation shifted, and Julian's mask slipped, just for a moment, as a gray-haired man across the table asked about his early days. "You climbed fast, Carter," the man said, swirling his wine. "What's the secret?" Julian's jaw tightened, his fingers curling around his glass until the knuckles whitened. "Sacrifice," he replied, his tone low, almost a growl. "I gave up what didn't matter to get what did." He paused, the silence heavy, then added, "I don't regret it." But the way his grip trembled, the faint crack in his voice, told a different story. I watched him, my breath catching, wondering what he'd buried beneath that polished exterior. The violin swelled, a mournful note threading through the room, and I seized the chance to push him. "What didn't matter?" I asked, my voice cutting through the hum, louder than I'd meant. Heads turned, but I didn't care. Julian's eyes snapped to mine, dark and unreadable, and for a heartbeat, I thought he'd ignore me. Then he leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear, the scent of cedar sharp and familiar. "A woman," he murmured, so low only I could hear. Someone who thought love could outweigh ambition. She was wrong. He pulled back, his face a mask again, but the words lingered, sparking something in me. Curiosity, maybe, or the first flicker of doubt about the man I'd married. I sipped my water, the glass cool against my lips, trying to steady the questions racing through my mind. Who was she? Why did his voice falter when he spoke of her? I wanted to hate him, needed to for Dad's sake, but that crack in his armor made it harder. The table moved on, chatter resuming, but I stayed quiet, my fingers tracing the rim of my glass, the crystal smooth and cold. Julian handed me a plate of dessert, chocolate torte, rich and dark, and our hands brushed, a fleeting warmth that startled me. "Eat," he said, his tone clipped like an order. I took it, the fork trembling slightly in my grip, and wondered if he'd meant to soften the moment or if I'd imagined it. Later, as the guests mingled, Julian stood to shake, hands leaving me alone at the table. I pushed the torte aside, its sweetness cloying, and let my thoughts drift to Dad. His cough, his frail hands, the way he'd looked at me the night before the wedding, eyes pleading for forgiveness. This marriage was for him, not Julian, I reminded myself. But then I spotted something. A photograph, slipped from Julian's jacket pocket when he'd risen, now lying face up on the velvet chair. I reached for it, my pulse quickening, and held it between my fingers. It was old, creased, showing two young men laughing in a wood-paneled office. One was Julian, unmistakable even then, his smile unguarded. The other was Dad, younger, vibrant, before debt and sickness had carved him hollow. My breath caught, a sharp ache blooming in my chest. They'd been friends, partners maybe, long before the betrayal I'd found in that attic box. I flipped the photo over, and there, in Dad's scrawl were the words, "To Julian, the brother I never had. 1985. The room spun, the violin fading to a distant wail. All this time, I'd thought Julian was just a cold opportunist, a stranger who'd crushed my family for profit. But this tied him to Dad in a way I couldn't unsee, a bond that made his rejection 20 years ago cut even deeper. I slipped the photo into my clutch, my hands shaking, as Julian returned. He didn't notice it was gone, his focus on the room, the power he wielded here. "Ready to leave?" he asked, his voice brisk, already moving toward the exit. I stood, the silk dress rustling, and nodded, though my mind was elsewhere. "Yes," I said, my tone steady despite the storm inside me. He offered his arm, and I took it, the fabric of his sleeve crisp under my fingers, a lifeline I didn't want to need. As we stepped into the night, the sea breeze sharp against my skin, I clutched the photo in my bag like a secret weapon. Julian thought he'd bought my silence, my compliance, but he didn't know me. Not yet. I'd play his perfect wife tonight, smile for his world, but I'd find the truth beneath his lies. For Dad, for the honor he'd lost, and maybe, just maybe, for the part of me that couldn't stop wondering who Julian Carter had been before he'd chosen ambition over everything else. The wind howled outside Julian's cliffside mansion, a restless gust that rattled the windows and carried the tang of salt through the cracks. I stood on the balcony, my hands pressed against the icy iron railing, the metal biting into my palms as I breathed in the wildness of the sea. It was late, past midnight, and the house was silent, save for the distant crash of waves against the rocks below. My hair whipped across my face, sticking to my lips. But I didn't move. I needed this, the rawness of it, to clear the fog that had settled over me since the banquet, since that photograph of Dad and Julian had slipped into my clutch like a shard of broken glass. I'd carried it with me all day, tucked inside the pocket of the navy coat Julian had given me, its edges worn from my restless fingers. But tonight, something else had fallen out. A letter, crumpled and stained, that I'd found in the coat's lining when I'd reached for the photo. It must have been Dad's, slipped in there years ago when he'd worn it, back when he and Julian were partners, not enemies. I unfolded it now, the paper crackling under my touch, and traced the words with my fingertips, imagining his voice. "Julian, I'm begging you," it read. "Don't let them take the company. We built this together. One last loan, that's all I need." The date was 2003, the year everything fell apart. Mom's cancer, the bankruptcy, Dad's slow unraveling. Julian hadn't just turned him away, he'd let him drown. The balcony door creaked behind me, and I shoved the letter back into my pocket, my heart thudding as Julian stepped out. His silhouette loomed against the dim light from the house, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up like he'd been wrestling with something in his office. The wind tugged at his hair, and for a moment, he looked less like the untouchable CEO, and more like a man fraying at the edges. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice low, roughened by the late hour. "It's cold." I didn't turn, my hands tightening on the railing. "I like it," I shot back, sharper than I meant. "It's the only thing here that feels real." He didn't respond right away, just stood there, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. Then he moved closer, his shoes scuffing the stone, and I caught the faint scent of whiskey on his breath, unusual for him, a man who thrived on control. "What's eating you, Claire?" he asked, and there was something in his tone. Not warmth, not quite, but a crack I hadn't heard before. I spun to face him, the wind stinging my eyes, and pulled the letter from my pocket, holding it up like a weapon. "This," I said, my voice trembling with the anger I'd bottled too. "Long, you betrayed my father. He begged you for help, and you turned your back. Now you think marrying me makes it right?" Julian's face didn't change, not a flinch, not a flicker, but his hand froze halfway to the letter, hovering in the air. The wind snatched at the paper, but I held it firm, my knuckles white. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, his words clipped, defensive. "That was business. He made bad calls, and I couldn't." I cut him off, stepping closer, the cold forgotten. "Couldn't what? Save him, or just didn't want to? You let him lose everything, his company, his pride, my mother's last years. And now I'm here, paying for your guilt. Tell me I'm wrong." He stared at me, the ocean's roar filling the space where his answer should have been. And for the first time, I saw something shift in him. A shadow crossing his eyes, a crack in the armor he wore like a second skin. "I didn't buy you," he said, his voice quieter now, almost lost in the wind. I needed you here, to make it right. The words hit me like a punch, raw and unguarded, and I stumbled back, the railing digging into my spine. Make it right? I laughed, bitter and sharp. You think a ring and a mansion fix what you broke? You don't even know me. He reached out then, his fingers brushing the letter, but I yanked it away, crumpling it in my fist. I know. More than you think, he murmured, his hand falling to his side. Your father was a good man, too good for this world. I couldn't save him then, but I can now. His eyes locked on mine, or so I imagined, their weight pressing into me, and I hated how those words stirred something, a flicker of doubt I didn't want to feel. I turned away, staring out at the invisible sea, my chest tight. You're a coward, I said, my voice breaking. You hide behind money and call it redemption. Julian didn't move, didn't argue, just stood there as the wind howled between us. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a key, the car key he'd given me days ago, the one I'd clutched like a lifeline. He pressed it into my hand, his fingers warm against my cold skin, lingering a moment too long. Go if you want, he said, his tone steady but strained. I won't stop you. I closed my fist around the key, its edges biting into my palm, and for a second, I saw myself running. Back to Dad. Back to the life I'd lost. But the image of him, coughing in that hospital bed, stopped me cold. I couldn't leave him to Julian's mercy, or lack of it. I shoved the key into my pocket, next to the letter, and met his gaze, or the space where it should be. I'm staying, I said, my voice hard. But not for you. For him. Julian nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible motion, and turned back to the house, the door clicking shut behind him. I stayed on the balcony, the wind tearing at my coat, the letter a heavy weight against my chest. He thought he could rewrite the past, but I'd dig until I found the truth. Not for his sake, but for Dad's honor, and maybe for the part of me that couldn't stop wondering what Julian was hiding beneath that storm of regret. The car's engine hummed beneath me as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white against the leather, the scent of gasoline sharp in my nose. I'd slipped out of the mansion before dawn, the key Julian had given me burning a hole in my pocket until I couldn't stand it anymore. Dad was in the hospital. Another collapse, the nurse had said over the phone, her voice clipped with urgency. He's asking for you. The words had jolted me awake, and now I sped through the gray streets of Boston, the sea wind replaced by the bitter chill of early morning, my coat flapping against the seat where I'd tossed it. I needed to see him, to hold his hand, to make sure he knew I hadn't abandoned him for Julian's world. The hospital loomed ahead, a squat brick building glowing faintly against the pre-dawn sky. I parked crookedly, my sneakers skidding on the wet pavement as I ran inside, the antiseptic smell hitting me like a slap. Dad lay in a narrow bed, tubes snaking from his arms, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. His eyes fluttered, open when I touched his hand. Cold, frail, the skin paper-thin. Claire, he rasped, a weak smile tugging at his lips. You came. I squeezed his fingers, my throat tight. Always, Dad, I'm here. But his smile faded, replaced by a grimace as he coughed, a wet, rattling sound that echoed in the sterile room. I sank into the chair beside him, my bag slipping to the floor, and something fell out. An old cassette tape, its label scratched but legible. Julian, 2004. My breath caught. It must have been in the coat, tucked away with the letter I'd found last night. Dad's eyes followed my gaze, widening slightly. Where'd you get that? He whispered, his voice hoarse. I hesitated, then pressed it into his hand. From Julian's things, What is it? He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he murmured, "Play it." I fumbled with the ancient recorder on the nightstand, my hands shaking as I inserted the tape. Static crackled, then Julian's voice filled the room. Younger, softer, but unmistakable. "Evelyn, I can't do this," he said, his words clipped with panic. "The baby, our baby. I can't let it ruin me. I'm sending money. Take her and go." A woman's voice followed, sharp and breaking. "You're a coward, Julian. She's yours, and you're throwing her away." The tape clicked off, leaving a silence so heavy it crushed me. Dad's hand tightened around mine, his breath ragged. "Sophie," he said, barely audible. "Your sister." The room spun, the antiseptic air choking me. A sister? Julian's daughter? My mind raced back to the letter, the betrayal, and now, this. A child he'd abandoned, a secret Dad had kept. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, my voice rising, cracking with hurt. Dad coughed again, weaker now. "I promised Evelyn. After Julian left her, she came to me, pregnant, broke. I helped her hide Sophie, to protect her from him." His eyes met mine, pleading. "I didn't want you to hate me, Claire." I pulled my hand away, stumbling to my feet, the tape clattering to the floor. Hate him? I didn't know what I felt. Anger, betrayal, a grief so deep it hollowed me out. I drove back to the mansion in a daze, the city blurring past, the key biting into my palm where I clutched it. Julian was in the foyer when I burst. Through the door, his shirt rumpled, a glass of whiskey in his hand, another crack in his perfect facade. He looked up, startled, but I didn't give him a chance to speak. "You had a daughter," I shouted, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "Sophie, you abandoned her, and my father, because you were too scared to lose your precious empire. Tell me I'm wrong." He froze, the glass slipping from his fingers to shatter on the floor, amber liquid pooling like blood. "Claire," he started, but I cut him off, stepping closer, my fists clenched. "Don't lie to me. I heard it. Your voice begging Evelyn to take her away. You let my dad carry your mess, and now he's dying because of it." Julian staggered back, his hand clutching his chest, his face paling. For a second, I thought it was guilt. Then he gasped, a sharp, pained sound, and collapsed, his knees hitting the floor with a sickening thud. Panic seized me. "Julian!" I dropped beside him, my hands shaking as I grabbed his shoulders. His breaths shallow and erratic. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, and I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. "Stay with me," I hissed, pressing my hand to his chest, feeling the wild thud of his heart. The operator's voice buzzed in my ear. Ambulance on the way, but it felt distant, unreal. Julian's hand grasped mine, weak but desperate, and he choked out, "I'm sorry. I didn't know." The paramedics arrived in a blur of lights and noise, shoving me aside as they worked on him. Chest compressions, oxygen mask, a stretcher rolling him out. I followed, my sneakers squeaking on the hospital tiles, the same halls I'd left hours ago. They wheeled him into the ER, and I sank onto a plastic chair, my coat stained with whiskey and tears I hadn't realized I'd shed. A doctor emerged later, too soon, too calm. "Heart attack," she said. "He's stable, but critical. You got him here just in time." I nodded, numb, and stumbled to his room. Julian lay there, tubes and wires snaking from his body, his chest rising faintly. I took his hand, warm now, fragile, and leaned close, my voice a broken whisper. "You have to live, Julian. Not for me, not for you, but for her, for Sophie. You owe her that. His fingers twitched, a faint squeeze, and I sank into the chair, the weight of the night crashing over me. I'd saved him, not out of love, but out of duty, the same duty that had bound me to this marriage. But as I sat there, the tape's words echoing in my skull, I knew this wasn't over. Not until he faced the truth, and I did too. The hospital room smelled of bleach and stale coffee, a sterile haze that clung to my skin as I sat beside Julian's bed, the steady beep of the heart monitor cutting through the silence. He'd been stable for 3 days now, his chest rising and falling beneath the thin blanket. But his eyes stayed closed, locked in a sleep I couldn't reach. I'd barely left his side, my sneakers scuffed from pacing, my coat draped over the chair, still reeking of whiskey from that night. In the quiet, I brewed tea in a cracked mug I'd found in the lounge, the mint scent a faint comfort as I pressed it to my lips, watching him. Every so often, I'd dab his forehead with a damp cloth, the cool water trickling down his temple, a small act that felt like defiance against the chaos he'd unleashed. The news had broken yesterday, splashed across tabloids and whispered in boardrooms. Julian Carter's mystery wife saves tycoon from heart attack. The headlines twisted it into a fairy tale, painting me as some devoted savior, but the comments online were uglier. Gold digger, they called me. She's in it for the money. I'd scrolled through them on my phone last night, my stomach churning until I'd tossed it aside, its screen dark against the hospital floor. I didn't care what they thought. I wasn't here for Julian's fortune. I was here for Dad, for Sophie, for the truth I'd dragged into the light. But the weight of their words pressed down anyway, a public trial I hadn't signed up for. The door swung open, shattering the stillness, and a woman stepped in. Tall, sharp-edged, her heels clicking like gunfire on the tiles. She wore a tailored coat, gray as steel, and her dark hair was pulled tight, framing eyes that cut through me like knives. "You must be Claire," she said, her voice crisp, laced with something bitter. "I'm Evelyn." My hand froze on the cloth, water dripping onto my lap, as recognition hit me. The voice from the tape, older now, but unmistakable. Sophie's mother. Julian's past. I stood, the mug clattering to the tray, and faced her, my pulse racing. "What do you want?" I asked, sharper than I meant, but I didn't trust her. Not yet. Evelyn didn't flinch, her gaze flicking to Julian, then back to me. "Justice," she said simply, stepping closer, her coat brushing the bed. "He's awake, you know. He's just too cowardly to face me." I glanced at Julian, his eyes still shut, his breathing unchanged. But a flicker of doubt crept in. Evelyn pulled a photo from her purse, tossing it onto the blanket. A young girl, maybe 20, with Julian's sharp jawline and dark hair. Sophie. "She's in Portland," Evelyn said, her voice cracking despite her steel. "Working double, shifts at a diner because he left us with nothing. I'm here to make him pay." I picked up the photo, my fingers trembling, the girl's tired eyes staring back at me. My sister, half-sister, a stranger I'd never known. "He didn't tell me," I said, my voice low, raw. "Not until I found the tape." Evelyn's lips twisted, a bitter smile. "Of course he didn't. But your father knew. He helped me hide her, gave me money when Julian wouldn't. And then Julian turned on him, too. Refused to save his company because it might have exposed us." Her words sank into me like stones, heavy with a truth I'd suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. Dad hadn't just been betrayed. He'd carried Julian's shame, a burden that broke him. "Why now?" I demanded, clutching the photo tighter. "Why come here after all these years?" Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her hands balling into fists. Because he's weak now. Vulnerable. I saw the news. Thought he might finally feel something. I want him to look Sophie in the eye and beg her forgiveness. She paused, her gaze softening, just for a second. And I heard about you, the wife who saved him. I figured you deserved to know who you're tied to. I sank back into the chair, the cloth slipping from my hand, my mind reeling. Julian stirred then, a faint groan escaping his lips, and his eyes fluttered open, hazy, unfocused, but alive. He saw Evelyn, and his face paled, a flicker of panic, breaking through his usual mask. "Ev," he rasped, his voice barely audible. She stepped forward, looming over him. "Don't you dare!" she snapped, her tone venomous. "You don't get to say my name, not after what you did." Julian's hand reached for mine, weak but desperate, and I let him take it, though my skin crawled. "Claire," he whispered. "I didn't know about Sophie, not all of it." "Liar," Evelyn spat, her voice rising. "You knew enough to run." She turned to me, her eyes blazing. "Get out while you can, Claire. He'll destroy you like he destroyed us." But I didn't move, my hand still in Julian's, the photo burning against my palm. I looked at him, frail, broken, a man I'd hated and saved in the same breath, and felt the weight of my choice. "I'm not leaving," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the tension. "Not yet. He owes Sophie and my father more than excuses. I'll make sure he pays." Evelyn studied me, her anger softening into something like respect. "You're stronger than I was," she said quietly, then handed me a slip of paper. Sophie's address, scrawled in black ink. "Find her. She deserves to know you." She turned on her heel, her coat swishing, and left, the door slamming. Shut behind her. Julian's grip tightened, his breath shallow. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with something, guilt, maybe, or relief. I pulled my hand away, standing, the photo and address clutched tight. "Don't thank me," I said, my tone cold, resolute. "This isn't forgiveness, it's a reckoning." I walked to the window, the rain tapping against the glass, and stared out at the gray city beyond. Evelyn's words echoed. Justice, not revenge. I'd stay, not for Julian, but for Dad's honor, for Sophie's future, for the family I hadn't known I had. The pressure of the past pressed down, but I wouldn't break. Not yet. I'd face it, all of it, and drag Julian through the fire with me until the truth burned clean. The sea stretched endless before the weathered cottage, its waves crashing against the shore with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Wild, alive, unyielding. Julian had insisted we come here, a week after his release from the hospital, his voice still weak but resolute as he'd handed me the keys to this place, his old retreat, hidden along the Maine coast. I stood in the doorway now, my fingers brushing the chipped paint of the frame, the salt air sharp in my lungs as I watched him struggle out of the car. He leaned on a cane, his suit replaced by a simple sweater, and I stepped forward, adjusting, his collar where it bunched against his neck. "Careful," I said, my tone softer than I'd intended, the wind snatching the word away. Inside, the cottage smelled of damp wood and memories. Faint traces of lavender lingered in the curtains, a ghost of the life he'd once had here with Evelyn. I set a kettle on the stove, the hiss of gas and the clink of mugs grounding me as Julian sank into an armchair by the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "This is where it started," he said, his voice rough, breaking the silence. "With her, with Sophie." I turned, a mug warm in my hands, and met his eyes, hollow, shadowed, but open in a way I hadn't seen before. "Why bring me here?" I asked, setting the tea beside him, the steam curling upward like a question. He took a shaky breath, his fingers trembling as they brushed the mug. "Because I've run long enough," he said. "I left them, Evelyn, Sophie, because I thought power was worth more than love. I was wrong. And I left your father to pick up the pieces because I couldn't face my own mess." His voice cracked, and he looked down, his shoulders slumping. "I want to find her, Claire. I want to make it right." The words hung there, raw and unguarded, and I felt something shift inside me, a crack in the wall I'd built against him, letting the first tendrils of belief seep through. I'd tracked Sophie down 2 days ago, using the address Evelyn had given me. She was in Portland, just as her mother had said, living in a cramped apartment above the diner where she worked. I'd called her, my voice shaking as I explained who I was, her half-sister, a stranger tied to her by blood and betrayal. She'd agreed to meet, her tone cold but curious, and now she was on her way. I glanced at Julian, his hands clasped tight, and nodded. "She'll be here soon," I said. "But you don't get to fix this with words. You prove it. With time. With action." The door creaked open an hour later, and Sophie stepped in. Tall, wiry, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, her eyes sharp like Julian's, but dulled by years of struggle. She carried a duffel bag, her diner uniform peeking out, smelling, faintly, of grease and coffee. "So," she said, dropping the bag with a thud, her voice flat. "You're the big shot who ditched me." Julian stood, wobbling on his cane, and I saw the pain flash across his face, not from his heart this time, but from her words. "Sophie," he started, his voice thick. "I'm so sorry." "Save it," she snapped, crossing her arms. "I didn't come for apologies. Mom said you're dying or something. Figured I'd see for myself." Her gaze flicked to me, softening slightly. "You're Claire, right? The sister I never got to meet because of him." I nodded, stepping closer, my hands twisting in my sweater. "Yeah, I didn't know about you either, not until recently. I'm here because family matters, even when it's broken." Sophie snorted, but her eyes lingered on me, searching. Julian took a step forward, his cane tapping the floor. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice steadying. "I was a coward. I left you and your mother with nothing because I was scared, of scandal, of losing everything I'd built. But I'm here now. I want to know you, Sophie. I want to help." She stared at him, her jaw tight, then turned away, looking out at the sea. "Help?" she muttered. "You think money fixes 20 years? "No," I cut in, my voice firm, surprising even myself. "It doesn't. But he's not the same man he was. Neither of us can undo the past, but we can start here." I touched her arm, hesitant, and she didn't pull away. Julian sank back into the chair, his hands shaking, and I saw tears glisten in his eyes, real ones, not the calculated kind I'd feared. Sophie stayed silent, her shoulders rigid, but she didn't leave. That night, as the waves roared outside, Julian pulled me aside, his grip weak but urgent. "Thank you," he whispered, his breath warm against my ear. "For bringing her here. For staying." He reached into his pocket and pressed something into my hand. A ring, old and tarnished, its band etched with faint initials. "It was Evelyn's," he said. "I kept it all these years. You're my strength, Claire. Not my wife on paper, but the one who's holding me accountable." I stared at the ring, its weight heavy in my palm, and felt my chest tighten. Not with anger, but with something deeper, something I hadn't expected. I slipped the ring onto my finger, its cool metal grounding me, and looked at him. "We're not done," I said, my voice soft but unyielding. You owe her more than this. And Dad, he needs to see you own up to it all. Julian nodded, his eyes red, and I pulled him into an embrace. Tentative, fragile, but real. Sophie watched from the doorway, her expression unreadable, but she didn't turn away. The sea roared on, relentless, and I knew this was just the beginning, of healing, of reckoning, of a family stitched together from the ashes of what we'd lost. The kitchen in Julian's cliffside mansion glowed softly under the morning sun, the scent of fresh bread wafting from the oven as I slid a tray onto the counter, my hands dusted with flour. Sophie stood beside me, her sleeves rolled up, slicing apples with a practiced flick of the knife, her movements sharp but steady. It had been 2 weeks since she'd moved in. 2 weeks of tentative steps toward something like family. The ocean hummed outside, a constant lullaby through the open windows, and I caught her faint smile as she popped a slice into her mouth, the crunch breaking the quiet. Not bad, she said, her voice still edged with wariness, but lighter than it had been at the cottage. Julian sat at the table, a newspaper spread before him, his cane propped against the chair. He looked better, color back in his cheeks, his hands steady as he turned the pages. But I saw the strain in his eyes, the weight of years he couldn't erase. I'd dressed him this morning, buttoning his shirt when his fingers faltered. The fabric soft under my touch. It was a routine now, one I hadn't expected to settle into, but there was a quiet strength in it. A partnership forged not from love, not yet, but from necessity and choice. Sophie glanced at him, her knife pausing, mid-cut, and I wondered what she saw. The father who'd abandoned her, or the man trying to claw his way back. The doorbell rang, a sharp chime that jolted us all, and I wiped my hands on a towel, my pulse quickening. Evelyn had called last night, her voice tight, clipped, warning me she'd come today. I opened the door, and there she stood, her gray, coat pristine, her eyes hard as steel. "Claire," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She carried a manila envelope, its edges creased, and tossed it onto the counter with a thud. "I've got an offer," she announced, her gaze sweeping from me to Julian, then settling on Sophie. "Take it, and I'll leave you all alone." Julian stood, slower than he once would have, his cane tapping as he approached. "What's this?" he asked, his voice rough but firm. Evelyn's lips curled, a bitter twist. "A deal. You sign? Over half your estate to Sophie. Call it reparations, and I'll take her back to Portland. No lawsuits, no scandal. You get your clean slate." Sophie dropped the knife, the blade clattering against the cutting board, and stared at her mother, her face paling. "You don't get to decide that," she snapped, her voice trembling but fierce. "I'm not a bargaining chip." I stepped between them, my hands raised, the flower still clinging to my fingers. "No one's signing anything," I said, my tone steady, cutting through the rising tension. "Sophie's here because she chose to be, not because of money or threats." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but I held her gaze unflinching. "You want justice? Fine. But this isn't it. This is control." She laughed, a short, harsh sound, and pointed at Julian. "You think he's changed? He'll ditch her again the second it gets hard. Like he ditched your father." Julian moved then, faster than I'd seen since the hospital, planting himself beside Sophie. "I won't," he said, his voice low, resolute, his hand resting on her shoulder, a tentative touch she didn't shrug off. "I've lost enough. I'm not losing her again. Or Claire. You want to fight me, Evelyn? Go ahead. I'll give up every damn penny before I let you take her." His words hung there, heavy with a conviction I hadn't heard before, and I saw Sophie's eyes soften, just a fraction, her breath catching. Evelyn stared at him, her fists clenched, then at me, searching, testing. "You're a fool, Claire," she said finally, her voice quieter now, almost resigned. "But maybe you're the glue he never had." She picked up the envelope, tucking it under her arm. "Keep her safe," she added, nodding at Sophie, then turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind her. The room exhaled, the tension draining like water through sand, and Sophie sank into a chair, her hands shaking as she reached for an apple slice. I turned off the oven, the bread's warmth seeping into the air, and sat across from them, my fingers brushing the ring Julian had given me, Evelyn's ring, now mine, a symbol I hadn't fully understood until now. "You okay?" I asked Sophie, my voice gentle. She nodded, chewing slowly, then looked at Julian. "You meant that?" she asked, her tone guarded but curious. He met her eyes, his own glistening. "Every word," he said. "I'm not perfect. God knows I've failed you. But I'm here now, for as long as you'll let me." She didn't answer. But the silence wasn't cold. It was a start. I stood, pulling the bread from the tray, its crust golden and crisp, and sliced it, the knife steady in my hand. We ate together, the three of us, the clink of plates and the rustle of napkins filling the space where words weren't needed yet. Later, as Sophie cleared the table, Julian pulled me aside, his hand warm against mine. "You've given me more than I deserve," he murmured, his voice thick. "A family I didn't earn." I looked at him, really looked, seeing the lines, etched by regret, the hope flickering beneath. "We're building it," I said, my tone firm but soft. "Not just for you, for her, for Dad, for me." He nodded, pulling me into a hug, his arm steady despite the cane, and I let myself lean into it, the sea's song a quiet promise outside. That night, I stood on the balcony, the dawn just breaking, its light painting the waves in gold. Julian joined me, his breath visible in the chill, and described it, the colors, the shimmer, like he'd done in the hospital. Sophie slept inside, her duffel bag unpacked, a small victory. "Honor isn't what you gave me," I said, my voice low, the ring glinting on my finger. "It's what we've made, together." He smiled, faint but real, and I knew this was our dawn. Not perfect, but ours. And that's the end of this journey. For now. If this story of heartbreak, redemption, and family moved you even a little, hit that like button to let me know. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next chapter of lives unraveling and rebuilding, one raw moment at a time. Your support keeps these tales alive. See you in the next one.